I'm extremely proud and privileged to introduce to you, for those of you who do not know him, Mr. Lynn Clarkson. He's the president of Clarkson Grain, whose home office is at Cerro Gordo, Illinois, and he's the managing director of Clarkson Soy Products. They are suppliers of selected organic and conventional grains and oil seeds for food processors. They operate grain elevators. They condition and process grain, have a barge station and rail sidings, and they provide contract and spot markets for crops picked up on farms as well as delivered to their facilities. Clarkson Soy Products, and you may not know this, processes organic soybeans into certified organic lecithin, flour, meal, crude, and refined oil. And as far as I know, you're the only one in the United States. Is that correct? The only one. Lynn is well educated. He has a bachelor's in political science from Knox College, a master's from Tulane University in political science, and his JD is from the University of Wisconsin. So if you want to argue with him, why, he can take you to court. He's well traveled. He deals with the European Union as well as Asian markets on the Pacific Rim. I've traveled with Lynn to South America. He works the South American continent as well, and he has a tremendous amount to offer in this particular meeting this morning, which is going to be about what happens and has happened on the AC-21 committee at the United States Department of Agriculture. The coexistence of GMO in our society. How are we going to handle it as growers, as processors? Please welcome Mr. Lynn Clarkson.
Good morning, Jack. Thanks for the introduction. This is a conversation I wish to have with you. It's a conversation we as a nation, we as a community are having. If you have answers to the problems that are posed, be happy to have them. I'm going to give you my perspective, my suggested solutions. There are other people at the table whose suggested solutions are 180 degrees out from mine. So if you would hold questions, outrage, criticisms, or jokes until I've wandered through this program, I would appreciate it. Okay, I need to share with you my personal perspective on this whole thing. I'm a merchant. I'm not a missionary for anything other than a happy client. Not my business to tell you what your values are. If you tell me you want to avoid GMOs, my job is to help you avoid them. If you told me you wanted them, okay. I don't interfere in that value decision on your part. As Jack said, my company and I supply selected varieties, selected qualities of corn and soybeans to makers of foods, feeds, and ingredients over much of the world. If you talk to processors who make anything and you say, what's the biggest problem you regularly have? If they're serious with you, 90-some% will tell you there's too much variation in incoming raw material. With variation, you have to change the cook times, you have to change the ingredients. There are not too many people that stay in Holiday Inns because they want an adventure. They stay there because they know what it's going to be like. That's what a food processor wants. That's what a feed processor wants. They want consistency. Consistency can also be defined by a word called purity. So I'm very involved in trying to get purity of whatever it is my client wants. GMO complicates that because of market differences. Functional GMO, which is just now arriving and has not yet appeared in Illinois in a serious way, complicates that exponentially. Now, why IP? Why do we identity preserve things? It's because of product issues. You want a certain characteristic that you can only get out of a certain hybrid of corn or a certain variety of soybean. You want a taste, you want a color, you want a flavor, you want a smell. Process issues. You can take different corns, start a processing plant. Some of them take 5 hours to get through. Some of them take an hour. Some of them absorb water quickly. Some of them don't. Almost everybody's process involves, whether it's a dry mill or a wet mill, involves transferring heat through a liquid. These things are critical, and there are significant differences among hybrids and varieties. Market issues. There are dozens, more than dozens, of market distinctions important to consumers. They range from very social issues about fair traded material to very serious technical issues about the amino acid concentration in something, or the protein levels in something, or the digestibility of a protein. So some of you heard this story before, but in the first year I was trying to be a supplier to anyone, I visited Dr. Lloyd Rooney at Texas A&M. Lloyd Rooney is the academician scientist who really turned making tortillas and tortilla chips into a science more than a mystery to many. So, question to Lloyd. Lloyd, how do I be a good supplier of agricultural raw materials to the tortilla industry? And in classic Western Kansas small school Lloyd colorful vernacular, he said, well, by God, son, I can make pretty good blankety-blank tortillas out of any blankety-blank blank that you give me, but don't you change blankety-blank between Monday or Wednesday or you'll really blank me up. His point was about avoiding variation, consistency. You can set your systems to work consistently if you're getting consistent stuff in the front door. Okay, now let's move into some social considerations. Monsanto, when they started bringing out Roundup Ready soybeans, invited food processors from around the world to come to a familiarization tour at their research facilities in St. Louis. And they're great research facilities. A gentleman who runs the Tokyo Food Co-op was a client of ours at the time. He was invited, and his office called my office and said, Mr. Clarkson, we've been invited to Monsanto for a tour. Would you please send along a cultural bodyguard? So he wanted somebody he knew to try and segregate the serious stuff from the fluff. Somebody from my company picked him and his group up at St. Louis Airport, and off they go. The familiarization tour was conducted by Dr. Molly Klein, microbiologist, PhD from the University of Illinois, bright lady. At the end of a 4-hour tour, she, as usual, asked the senior member of the visiting delegation, what was your opinion of the tour? The gentleman from Japan stood up and said, Dr. Klein, we very much appreciate your science. We think it's world class. We encourage you to continue your research. Dr. Klein, how many years have you been researching biotech? Molly's answer was 13 years. That gentleman then looked at his watch and said, in my country, we would wait 30 years, one generation, before we introduce something like this to our food system. Please, Dr. Klein, call me in 17 years. I could be your best client, but I prefer to wait. What did he just do? He articulated something called the precautionary principle that many of our fellow citizens like to make fun of when it's exercised by Europeans or Japanese or anybody else in the world. Well, those people articulating the precautionary principle are my clients. They're your clients. They're our clients. And I think that's a reasonable perspective to take. So the Tokyo Food Co-op says to Clarkson Grain Company, please do everything you can to keep GMOs out of my product stream. To which we say, what does that mean? Everything. What's your tolerance level? Well, I don't want any. Any's an impossibility in the United States. But if you give me a tolerance that I can work with, we can do it. He doesn't know what a reasonable tolerance is, so he asks us. And we have, time and time again, said 0.9% is the tolerance level we can work with. And he accepted that. Now, back on the process end of things, I want to relay a comment from the Vice President of General Mills, in charge of raw materials. Very few presidents or vice presidents of companies stand up and say things the way the gentleman from General Mills does. They ran an IP experiment at one of their wheat mills. I think it was in Minnesota, could have been in Nebraska. They switched from buying a commodity to buying a particular variety of wheat. Their process yield went up 30% by going for greater consistency. 30%. That's in a mature industry that ought to give its commercial eye teeth for a 2% increase in process yield. That's fantastic. A couple years down the road, they added something to it. Instead of buying that variety anywhere it came from in the Midwest, they cut the origination area to a radius of 60 miles. So you had similar weather conditions, or very similar weather conditions. I'm not sure that holds real well, having just watched Illinois last summer with rains differing across a half mile. But the process yield went up again about another 4 or 5%. That's fantastic. So that has become part of, I think, his operating procedures. And the point to make is homogeneity is important. Now, the picture of the baseballs here is just to tell you everybody wants every kernel, every bean to be exactly the same. Not going to happen, but we're moving closer to that. Companies like mine screen soybeans and corn through machines called optical scanners. Optical scanners have gotten so well sophisticated with new computer power that the latest generation, you can change the protocols on the go. You have in your computer pictures of good beans, bad beans, funky beans, not so good beans, and you can match it. You can hesitate a computer screen that's watching the throughput. You can stop it. You can put your finger on the bean that you don't like the looks of and have it rejected. So you can adjust the quality going through. You can adjust for consistency. Now, you can do that in different wavelengths. It doesn't have to be what humans can see. There can be other wavelengths. I want to flag that point with you because there's a point where you could put a marker on materials in the commodity system so that we could move some out, move some in, and segregate. So, for the Japanese, for many people, we get unwanted GMO, and if you're talking in normal speak, you'd call it contamination. If you're talking in politically accepted speak, you call it adventitious presence. So, where do we get the adventitious presence coming from? There's a background adventitious presence across our production area coming from seed. Just as it's difficult for us in the grain trade to keep perfectly segregated crops in the field, it is extremely difficult and almost impossible for the seed companies to keep 100% purity. So what does purity mean? If you're buying a bag of non-GMO seed from a seed company, what does it mean? I don't see too many bags with a label on it saying this means it has less than X. Basically, it's best wishes and best intent at the moment, and I don't believe that there's any regulation of it. We have cross-pollination issues. We test at my company every load that comes in for GMOs. Test every load of corn that comes in for aflatoxin. We can see as farmers move away from their fence rows, move away from their side roads, a decrease in GMO contamination. We can get by pretty well in providing non-GMO, defined my terms, less than 0.9%, reasonably easily. Just so you'll know, we reject probably 3 loads out of 100 loads of corn for GMO. We reject probably 1 load out of 200 loads of soybeans for GMO. If we're looking just at organic corn and using data that goes beyond my data, probably 10 to 11 loads of the organic corn would fail the GMO test. I don't know precisely why that is, but my guess is the organic fields are smaller, and so they have more of their surface area subject to pollen drift. So pollen drift, to me, is the part that's most difficult to control. We have errors in planting, harvesting, handling, storing. People pull out of the wrong bin, deliver things, all sorts of mistakes get made. Now, I want to plant in your head something I'll come back to. Let's plant the idea that biotech comes up with a super corn that is really wonderful for one industry, really terrible for other industries. But it is such a super corn that its adventitious presence at minuscule levels, tiny levels, far less than I mentioned are acceptable for cultural distinctions, changes the characteristic of other corn. How would you deal with that? Okay, this conversation is picked up by the USDA, appropriate place to have it. The USDA created a number of years ago AC21, the long name USDA Advisory Committee on Biotechnology and 21st Century Agriculture. There was a first generation of this committee that met several years ago, and then the current generation of this committee started meeting about 2 years ago. The committee charge, I will read to you. 3 questions. I think these were probably seriously debated inside the USDA, phrasing and the order of the questions. The committee is charged to address the following questions. 1, what types of compensation mechanisms, if any, now underline if any because it comes back a lot in discussions, would be appropriate to address economic losses by farmers in which the value of their crops is reduced by unintended presence of genetically engineered materials. Number 2, what would be necessary to implement such compensation mechanisms? That is, what would be the eligibility standard for a loss, and what tools and triggers would be needed to verify and measure such issues and determine if a claim were compensable? Number 3, in addition to the above, what other actions would be appropriate to bolster or facilitate coexistence among different agricultural production systems in the United States? Now, almost everybody wants to go to number 3 and ignore 1 and 2. I suspect that the managers at the USDA forced people into number 1 to try and get an agreement that people are being damaged, and then discuss the difficulties of coming up with a compensation system with the thought that maybe people would do what I think they'll do, to decide that prevention's a lot better idea than compensation. Okay, the compensation mechanisms. Well, I will read out the 5 recommendations that we came up with. Recommendation 1, to strengthen the understanding of the impact of unintended GE presence in identity preserved products, USDA should evaluate data it has gathered under recommendation 4, beginning to sound quite legal, regarding actual economic losses by farmers who grow crops for identity preserved markets. If the Secretary, in considering the loss data, determines that the situation warrants development of a compensation mechanism to help address such losses, the Secretary should implement such a mechanism based on a crop insurance model. 2, USDA should spearhead and fund a broad-based, comprehensive education and outreach initiative to strengthen understanding of coexistence between diverse ag production systems. USDA should design and make available to the ag community voluntary and outcome-based strategies for facilitating production of all types of identity-preserved products. 3, USDA should work with ag stakeholders, including, but not limited to, tech providers, seed companies, commodity and farmers organizations, ag trade and marketing companies, and organizations, public organizations and state and local governments develop a package of specific mechanisms that foster good crop stewardship and mitigate potential economic risk derived from unintended gene flow, and 2, promote and incentivize farmer adoption of appropriate stewardship practices. Recommendation 4, USDA should fund and or conduct research in a number of areas relevant to the promotion of coexistence. Recommendation 5. USDA should task the NGRAC, and I've lost touch with what all these letters mean, to develop a plan in conjunction with the seed industry for ongoing evaluation of the pool of commercially available non-GE and organic seed varieties and identification of market needs for producers serving GE-sensitive markets. USDA should work with seed suppliers to ensure that a diverse and high-quality commercial seed supply exists that meets the needs of all farmers, including those supplying products to GE-sensitive customers. These activities should be conducted in such a way as not to interfere with functioning markets, and the activities should be independent of regulatory approvals of GE products. USDA should also recommit to maintaining the original genetic identity of accessions in its germplasm banks. Okay. There are 22, 23 members in this committee. One committee member, well, the committee was organized in an unusual fashion. I recommend this to you if you want people to sign on to anything committees decide. You can sign on to support with comments. You can sign on to support without any comments. You can sign on to say you don't sign on, I disagree with the whole thing, with comments or without comments. So if you believe that we should be in a dialogue about this rather than fight it out like the Afghanis and the Pakistanis, you're probably going to sign on with comments and express your disagreements in the comments. Every one of the signer honors and the disagreeers have comments that you can read and review. Mine basically said, gee, this is nice, we're still civil, nobody died at the table, but we sure didn't move anything down the road very far. And how can you criticize any of these recommendations? They're sufficiently bland and sufficiently mom, apple pie, and blue sky that who's going to say they're unreasonable? But they didn't really grab the bull by the horns. There are some things that could have been done. It was quite a disappointment to many people on this committee from both sides of this issue about this situation. Now you need to know what role this dialogue has or what place it has at the USDA. Support for this comes from Vilsack and Merrigan. And while I know from listening in coffee shops across Illinois, I could probably arrange a lynching squad for either of these people within a 10-mile radius, I think they're doing a wonderful job. I think they've opened up the USDA so that there's no longer one path to the market. There are various paths to the market. Different styles, different cultures of agriculture are getting support. Vilsack speaks on this, I think, with heart, with intelligence, articulation, and he comes in. He has come to half of the meetings that this committee has had. Merrigan's probably been to half or more, and they have seen that all of the key department heads, one layer down from them, the USDA, are paying attention, are involved in these meetings. So this is strongly supported from the top down of the USDA. One day, Secretary Vilsack came, and in his pronouncements, he was saying, you know, there's a war going on in American agriculture, and we need to get some answers. We need to show the world that we can solve situations like this and not be blocked. One of my colleagues immediately raises his hand and takes offense at that. I'm offended that you suggested that there's disagreements and battles and a war going on in agriculture. Why, we all love each other out in agriculture. There's no war going on. To which Vilsack says, you know, maybe you should come sit in my office. Now, Attila the Hun was a popular guy at one time, and as he was going into India and other parts, he said, hey, there's no war going on, everybody's happy, because he was beating up on everybody. He had no sensitivity to anybody that was beating up on him. So you have a lot of different perspectives around the table. And it's important that the USDA put a broad community there. They've got almost every attitude and perspective that you can imagine as to what one's responsibilities to one's neighbors might be. So the next steps for this, does this die in these committee suggestions just go away? Well, there was a presentation made by some of the committee members and the directors to the heads of the USDA, and the report says that Vilsack indicated that the report was taken seriously, that we would see evidence of that toward the end of 2012, and hoped that a series of specific actions would be taken in 2013. As for future work of AC 21, Vilsack noted that some work may remain on aspects of the recommendations made in the report, and added the first task for USDA in this regard might be to see which members of the committee wish to remain and do additional work. To the best of my knowledge, all committee members have been asked if they would participate in continued meetings. To the best of my knowledge, all have. A few did it very publicly, and most did it privately, sent in notes and saying they'd be happy to go ahead. Now, there are different camps, but I'll get into that later. I want to make a comment about Kathleen Merrigan. I don't know how many of you know her. I don't believe that there would be a national organic program without Kathleen Merrigan. She was working in the USDA, and at that time, organic was pretty much a religious movement with different sects, and you had one group saying, my religion organic is better than your religion organic, is better than yours. And a consumer, this is confusing. This is difficult. I didn't know what would happen to the market when we came out with a standard, but the market took off, and it is growing significantly since then. There are complaints, there are concerns, there are problems. It looks to me like the NOP is trying to address those. There are concerns that certain sectors control things. To the best of my knowledge, it's still pretty much a wide open debate. But Kathleen Merrigan has done a superlative job of bringing organic into all aspects of the USDA. She is not just there for organics. She has the breadth of U.S. agriculture to tend and support. I think she's doing a nice job of that. But you no longer walk in and talk to a blank wall if you're talking about organic issues. You have an advocate who understands and thinks it's important. Now, let's see. Okay. Now, in addressing the questions, the charges that the Secretary put in front of AC 21, you go back to that first one. What types of compensation mechanisms, if any? So the if any issue is the first thing to work about. Claim number one, there is no damage. What are you people talking about? Why are we here? This is a waste of time. Everybody's happy. Flip side is, you've got to be kidding. People are sacrificing parts of their farms to try and set up segregation areas. People are being rejected. Show us the data, says the other side. Who has been rejected? Show me what they've lost. The first line of discussion is about organics. So what are you guys talking about? Organics. Organics is a process definition, not a product definition. So you can't be rejected anywhere. You can't have a loss because you've got GMO in. Counterpoint. Well, yes, organic is defined as a process definition, but this is all about markets. And the market doesn't want organic with GMO in it. Sure, it's organic. But more and more people are writing their contracts so that I want to buy organic, and here is my GMO tolerance standard. So you can have organic, but it's not going to get into markets you want unless it's under the tolerance factor of many buyers. And these are market considerations. Now, we've moved outside of the world of religion, and what's the market willing to deal with? How do you get that data? Who's going to share the data with you? How many people are farmers in this room? Okay. You willing to send me a list of every loss that you've had based on things? Some of you probably are, and some of you aren't. Now you ask grain companies, because we collect this data. How many grain companies are going to want to send you a list of rejections? Names stripped out, so nobody knows it's tied to a farmer, but how many are willing to do that? To the best of my knowledge, there were 3. My company was one of them. There are 2 others, and there's some that have wonderful data. The best non-GE or the GE data and the tolerance level data you could get are from companies that serve the Japanese. The non-GMO market and this issue of adventitious presence is bigger there, going to Japan, than the organic market in the United States. And the data should be very similar. Those companies are unwilling to share the data for whatever reason. So we took the best data we had. And in our case, I tell you that our company uses EnviroLogix test kits, and we have a strip reader so we can quantify GMO issues. So you'll know it costs us about $35 every time we run a test, and we run a test on every truck, whether that truck has 10 bushels in it or 1,000 bushels in it. And it's recorded in a computer base, so we can read it out, strip names off, and share it. I was on the committee that was trying to quantify the losses. Because you can't quantify a loss, then people are going to tell you it doesn't exist. Go away. What I came up with is when you add up everything that I could find in the United States on non-GMO, and assuming the rejection levels that we have seen in the Midwest, my company and 2 others, the total losses to the organic community and the conventional community for non-GMOs was about $40 million. That's not even a rounding error to the USDA's budget. Now, if it's your problem, it could be a huge problem. So on the scale of the United States, it's not huge, but it is a problem for some of our farmers that certainly has to be addressed. Now, the counter to that is, well, we don't have any direct data of losses to farmers. All you've given us is a percentage of loads you rejected, and you conjured the losses. Which I say, now, how reasonable do you have to be? It's pretty much a direct correlation. The answer to that was that organic farmer that you rejected, he just went to another organic market. Okay, sometimes he does. But what happens to the guy that drives all the way from Nebraska to deliver us a load, and we can't take it? That guy has $2 a bushel, maybe $3 a bushel in trucking costs, and no way of finding a market. We will certainly be helpful to try and find an alternative market. We do not like to reject things. We don't want to reject things. We want stuff to arrive, pass all the standards, and make a happy client. And we're keenly aware of the suffering when you do reject something. But there are losses there. And as more and more companies get pushed to join the non-GMO project or other non-GMO issues, movements, it is going to become more common and probably close in on 100% of the organic contracts saying organic to me, the buyer, means less than X GMOs. And that's what this committee was put together to deal with, not whether it's organic or not, it's whether there are losses. Compensate. There are 1 or 2 members on this committee who are former secretaries of agriculture of states. And one of those gentlemen, I believe, is currently the president of an insurance company, and his suggestion was a risk retention pool. Basically, the parties at risk put together their own pool of money and compensate for losses. Then there was a discussion of matching this, the issues here, with the normal crop insurance system of paying people for losses. And then we have discussions about a compensation fund. There was strong interest in a compensation fund from the organic advocates in the room. There was strong opposition from almost everyone else. You can see that the recommendations didn't come up with much of anything on that except more study. And this led directly into probably the most contentious issue, is if you're going to compensate, who pays? There was a group that thinks the biotech seed providers should pay, that this is part of the social costs of their product, and it is unfair to export that social cost to the rest of society. The folks from the biotech community pointed out that they had spent a lot of money to bring their stuff to fruition, and they felt it was unfair and it would be restrictive to future developments to put the burden on them. There was a strong group saying, what are you talking to me about? That's your problem, you who suffered the loss. You're getting a premium. So if you have to have 500 feet of segregation barrier, that's your fault. The premium is supposed to pay for that. That's what you get the premium for. Now, if you go back in a little organic history, you'll recognize we were paying significant premiums before there ever were GMOs. And the premium is for supply and demand. It's not so much the segregation issue. But we have a number of folks that serve on this committee that think that you are responsible for everything that goes on your farm, and your neighbors in the industry have no responsibility to share with you. It's a key word here, sharing. There's difference of opinions about sharing. Now, there's a slight wrinkle on this. You, Mr. Organic Farmer, have 100% of responsibility. The wrinkle is, okay, I'm your biotech neighbor. If I put in a segregation barrier on my farm, then you should pay me part of the premium that you're getting off your farm. Now, I personally find that one really difficult to understand and accept, but I'm telling you that there are people that look reasonable, act reasonable, and are on this committee that think that that is perfectly appropriate. The neighboring farmer. That's where this comes in. What does the neighboring farmer have? What is his responsibility to his neighbor? Is it none? Is it some? What is it? And there's a significant contingent that feels that the neighboring farmer has no responsibility whatsoever. U.S. General Fund. Okay, so there's $40 million worth of losses. By the way, they're putting together an administrative system to handle paying out $40 million in compensation. That would probably cost $200 million. But U.S. General Fund, when I talk to people who are more knowledgeable than I about the way politics work in D.C., they tell me the only way to get compensation is the general fund. We all know that we as a group are seriously in debt to ourselves and the rest of the world, and some of us feel guilty about asking the general fund to pay for things that we think are privately determined. But it's there. One of the gentlemen on this committee runs UNFI, United Natural Foods Incorporated, the largest distributor of organic and natural foods. He raised his hand one day and said, well, why don't we just have the corn checkoff pay for it? Wow, that provoked a bit of outrage. Those programs can't be touched for those uses. They exist for marketing purposes. But the flip side to that is, isn't this a marketing purpose? Keeping the markets pure so people want to buy your product? Letting people rely on what you're doing? So we have this puzzle here. Who is responsible? Now, if you're going to compensate somebody, what's the trigger? What's your tolerance level? What is damage? Now, I would think this is a fundamental issue. But the majority of this committee doesn't want to talk about tolerance levels at all for anything. That is a private contract. It's determined between you and a buyer. Well, at what level are we going to compensate for? Are we going to let private industry or private guys set up a tolerance level of 1 in 100,000 or 1 in 10? What's it going to be? If we're insuring, what's a reasonable level of insurance for us to pay for? It's a legitimate question, and it wasn't addressed by this committee. It was put off, canned down the road. Now, a tolerance level offers guidance to seed companies How much GMO can I put in that bag of non-GMO? What do I look for? Companies like mine, we buy stuff. Without numbers, we don't know what to do. We need numbers. We live by numbers. Most of what you do, much of what you do in life is governed by numbers. Why can't we get people to agree on this? Over here, well, the reason is that the biotech industry has significant, overwhelming concern that anytime you set up a tolerance and make a distinction, you are suggesting there's something wrong with their product, or you're suggesting that it's less than perfectly safe. I would like to set that argument aside and say, you asked me to set up a compensation scheme for loss. I can't do that without a tolerance factor. So let's talk about it. It has nothing to do with your safety. It has to do with some people want your product and some don't. And if you want more people to want your product, then get out and market it the way everybody else does and quit asking the government and the rest of us to sell it. That's a minority position. Market factors. This is all about markets and what people want, what they're going to accept. On a cultural level, just to give you a rundown, about the broadest level accepted anywhere in the world is 5% tolerance. And 5% was negotiated, I think, by the US government with the Japanese government, with mega companies sitting around the table and saying, okay, that's something we can do and it's reasonable and it addresses your issue. My company serves clients in Japan, and until about a week ago, no client we ever dealt with in Japan wanted more than 0.9. No one wanted to be as loose as the Japanese government. They wanted to be able to tell their clients that they had done a better job. And you can live with the 0.9 pretty nicely. But 5% is the broadest. Then you move down to 0.9, and 0.9 gets you into almost every market in the world. For a while, it didn't get you into Korea. Korea had a 0 tolerance, and they meant it. It's kind of crazy because if you're going to get anything from the United States, it's probably not going to hit 0, not on any scale. Korea has changed their rules, and it's easier to get stuff into Korea now. In Europe, it's 0.9. Above 0.9, you're going to label. A lot of people don't want to label. It's legal, but you have to label. And then if you go for major grocery stores in the UK, the standards are the tightest that I know of, and it's 0.1. Now, as a company, I can tell you we can hit 0.1 by cherry picking the flow of stuff. But I can't go out and contract for a program with any reliance that I'm going to be able to hit 0.1. So what do we got for segregation protocols going on that could be used here? Well, hybrid selection and seed purity testing. When I sit down with the scientists, not the marketing troops, but the scientists who work for major seed companies, I say, how are you doing in your seed fields and keeping them pure? The normal response is, I wish you hadn't asked that. I say, yeah, but I did. So how are we doing? We're fighting to hold it at 3%. Now, that's just one. I mean, there are different answers. Some answers tighter, some answers looser. But 3%. So then I go back to the marketing division and say, okay, I'm buying non-GMO seed from you, and I'm encouraging farmers to buy non-GMO seed from you. What does that mean? I don't really know. She said, good question. Well, what's the good answer to this one? Well, the good answer is I'm fighting a fight to put a label on the bag. But if you guys come up with a tolerance level for seed, that is AC21, that's bad. I said, why? Because you're going to be forced to be responsible? Yep. And you might force us into such responsibility that we can no longer do this and have to quit. Now, that was a major seed provider I'm talking to, and it would be difficult to fill in the gap if that company quit. But these things don't have to happen instantly. You can scale into these things over a number of years. And if the tolerance levels were set at levels that I think are reasonable, hopefully they could do this. I start out by asking, what level would you be comfortable with for GMO tolerance in your seed bags? The first answer is 5%. Somebody's been to the same seminar because you get a lot of 5%ers. You know, it just won't work. I don't have anybody, almost anybody in the world that's going to accept it. Well, what's the next you could do? 2. I said, I had more in mind 0.4. Oh, ouch. Yes, that's difficult to do. But if we don't start at 0.4, 0.5 in seed, by the time it runs through commercial production, it's not going to get better. I think we can still come in under 0.9 on a regular basis. But we've got to start out with seed levels at someplace under 0.5, I think, to get this done. Now, do I know exactly the numbers I'm talking about? No, I'm shooting from the hip. But I think these numbers are reasonably accurate. Segregation when you're IPing something, non-GMO, organic, whatever. In my own company, in deciding whether to put a segregation requirement in contracts, we've decided to treat farmers like adults. Some farmers don't want to be treated like adults, but some do. And we basically said, look, this is what we want. You pick out how to get us what we want. Now, 100 feet of segregation between cornfields will take out about 99.5% of the pollen drift. 15 to 20 feet of segregation will probably handle things in soybeans. Those aren't huge numbers. And if you had a sharing community, that might be 50% on the IP farm, 50 feet on the IP farm for corn, and 50 feet on the other. What are these numbers based on? The Europeans, these folks that we like to make jokes about, tease and torment, they're not bad in technology, and they've had lots of studies going on. I spoke with a gentleman who runs the GMO research division for the EU, and he shared with me 10 years of test data on pollen dispersion of corn. And granted, Europe isn't the United States, but how much different are we in wind blowing and pollen drifting? And they have provided really fine data for segregation distances needed from 0.9 down to 0.1% tolerance factors. They're basically saying in most cases 70 feet of segregation would handle it to the 0.9 level for corn, and 10 or 15 feet would be enough for soybean. So it's not a huge amount of land that needs to be set aside at that level. But I've stuck up here market factors for functional. We're going to come back to this. These could be much, much tighter than what I'm calling the cultural division of 0.9. Okay. Where do we really place this on responsibility for farmers? We got anything going shared between neighbors and the biotech providers? You put a clause in the tech contract for a guy planting triple stack that he has to have segregation to protect his neighbor if his neighbor has sensitivities? Do we put the burden 100% on the IP producer? You guys? Where do we get it? This is critical at this committee, and there's absolutely no agreement on it. We also step into the argument of science versus market. And the biotech folks are saying science is on our side. You don't have any reason to think that this is unhealthy, unsafe. Then I come back and say, I'm not out here to win a science argument. I don't know enough to evaluate the science. I don't have a position. My job is to please a client. My clients don't want it. So what are you doing telling me I win the science argument? I just lost the economy. So we square away from that one and we get no agreement. And it always goes back, I think, to this concern about the image of biotech. Now, biotech isn't entirely homogeneous. You've got biotech A and biotech B. Some may be good, some may be bad. And I'm about to show you what I think is a change in the weather over this issue. The counter to this image issue, I think, has to be this one. Conditions are just marked. What we're asking for are market distinctions. So save the science argument. What's the difference between, as Henry Ford used to say, yeah, you can have every color you want except black, but I don't want black. I want white. If you don't give me white, I'm going to go to somebody that does give me white. It's a marketing distinction. What's wrong with that? Okay, can we find common ground here? Can we get the folks that believe that any restriction on GMO is a total restriction? Can we get them to think that maybe we should be paying more attention to how we maintain purity between the fence lines or across the fence lines? A couple years ago, the USDA approved amylase corn. That might have been appropriate, but I think a mistake was made in approving it without conditions. However, under the regulatory structure we have, I'm not sure the USDA had the right to add conditions. If they don't, under the current regulatory structure, I think the regulations need to be changed. So, amylase corn. How many here have heard about amylase corn? Okay, a minority. Amylase comes with its own enzyme. It is a wonderful product if you want to take starch and make ethanol. The enzyme chews up the starch, moves it along toward becoming alcohol. Whoops, this thing has an enzyme that chews up starch? What if I want starch? This is a disaster. If you're making a cornflake, if you're making a tortilla or a tortilla chip. This is not good. But the ethanol industry has a significant cost in currently buying the enzymes to add to the corn that they're bringing in to break it down. Syngenta came up with a biotech corn that does it on its own. You don't have that expense anymore. They are paying farmers a 40, if I remember correctly, a 40-cent per bushel premium to raise it. Last year it was on a test basis on several thousands of acres in Kansas, and there was an effort at doing it in Nebraska, but I think the weather sort of wiped that one out. This year they're starting on more plans, and ultimately they hope to have millions of acres of this corn out and about. Now, this corn was opposed by the North American Millers Association. It was opposed by the U.S. Export Grains Council. It was opposed by the Grocery Manufacturers Association. These are not people who are opposed to GMOs. These people are supporters of biotech, but they are very, very concerned about this. Talking to somebody at Kraft, he says, this ruins the heat stability and the moisture stability of our corns. We won't know what's in the bottom of your box of cornflakes until you open it. You could be negatively surprised. This is not good. And to this date, my understanding that Syngenta has refused to provide any samples to the corn millers so they could test and see. The data I'm giving you comes from Syngenta itself. This is not something I or anybody else I know has gone out and put together. This is comes from Syngenta's presentation to a number of organizations it hoped to enlist in supporting this that are not supporters of this. So the enzymes in this corn are so good that you don't need to process 100% this corn to get the benefits for ethanol. One part of this corn with maybe 10 parts of conventional corn, you got everything you need. Now, who loses here? I pretty much laid that out for you. But if you're making cornflakes, one part of this corn in 10,000 parts. I told you the cultural distinctions, the cultural entry points to the markets in the world, 0.9. Call it 1%. This is 0.01%. This is tiny. This is so tiny I can't measure it as a grain company. I have to have tests that work with the logistics of a farmer. I can't say, dear Mr. Farmer, excuse me, can I keep your truck for 3 days? I need to give him his truck back within half an hour. So I have to have a strip test. There is no strip test available that goes that low. But the consequences of getting it into a shipment to somebody who's making cornflakes could be a disaster. So I don't know that I'm misserving my client. You don't necessarily know you're misserving me. And a client doesn't know when he gives it to you, the consumer, that you're going to have a bad thing in your box. Not good. Now, there's another market that's a significant user of corn. Been around for a long time. Not the kind of market we want to throw away. It's a market that makes tortillas and tortilla chips called alkaline milling. 18 parts in 10,000 ruin any corn for making a good tortilla, making good masa, a tortilla chip. I can't measure that low. About the lowest we can measure today with strip technology is 0.25. So I'm significantly lower than that today. Okay. What are the consequences of this? Given the perspective I've just shared with you, somebody suggested that the Syngenta program manager for this product and I should talk. And we talked, and he's doing a nice job of trying to promote this for his company. I understand that. And this is a good product for an industry. And I wouldn't have any objections to it if it stayed on the farms on which it was grown. So, he said, well, why are you upset about this at all? We're not planting any of it in Illinois. Behind the scenes, I think the reason for that is the Illinois Farm Bureau thought it would be a bad idea in a state that feeds a lot of food companies and has a lot of seed growing to have it anywhere in our state. And there is a bright soul at the Farm Bureau that essentially blocked that, I believe. I'm putting some dots together here, but I believe that that happened. And I thank her very much. It is now in Iowa. It's going to be in Minnesota. It's going to be in Nebraska, Kansas. So he said, so you don't have anything to worry about. It's not in Illinois. I said, well, where do you think we buy? He said, in Illinois. I said, right, but it's partial answer. We also buy in Iowa, Nebraska, Minnesota, and other states. Come back to that is, if you'll tell us where you intend to plant, we'll work with you and try and stay out of those areas. Now, I want you to know I'm in business, so we will talk, and we will try to avoid this. But I absolutely want you to understand who was left out of that conversation. There was not a farmer in that conversation. So what do you have going on here? You have private zoning going on in the U.S. Midwest without any public input. This is a significant situation that I believe needs to be stopped. Now, if I know what's going in Iowa, and I know it's a problem that I can't detect with a strip test, I really want to know where this is, because I'm not going to buy anything within miles of it. So, what's this going to do to Iowa? If you're a farmer in Iowa, you've been providing things to Kraft, Kellogg's, Azteca Milling for years. Those markets may just leave you, not because of anything you did. The risks of doing business with you just went up fantastically. So I would suggest Iowa, with the concentration of ethanol plants, is a state that companies like mine will find ourselves avoiding. Is that what Iowa wants? I don't know. I injected the issue of functional traits in the AC 21 discussions. And the management AC-21 gave me the opportunity to make a presentation, not unlike this one, but with more detail to the members. After the presentation, one party says, fine job, thanks, this is super interesting. I say, this was a hatchet job. How could you be so unreasonable and unfair? I don't know, it happens. One tries to be honest in these things, and if somebody else has a difference of opinion that has traction, makes any sense, climbs into my brain, I'd be happy to listen to it. But this looks like a serious problem when we get down to the functional traits. So if we're going to set up tolerance levels, one tolerance level could apply to the cultural traits, but when you get down to functionality, you're going to be varying all over the map. Now, this trait has an impact on process characteristics at 1 part in 10,000 for some industries, 18 parts for another, and less for others. In some, it's inconsequential. There can be other GMOs coming out that are even more powerful. So, whoops. So, what recommendations can we make? What recommendations can you make? This is your community. Everybody's involved here somehow as a consumer, I believe. Many are involved as producers here and trying to connect the markets. So this isn't any longer just an organic or a GMO. You can't shove us over in the corner and say, well, that's just your issue. This is GMO against GMO. Because the pollen out of this genetically functional trait doesn't care whether you're a GMO crop or an organic crop or a non-GMO crop. It's going to change how your corn performs. So I think everybody in the room's in the same place. Now, I took a thoughtful member of this committee aside and said, what do you think when I told you about this? He said, I didn't believe you. I said, well, what do you think? I created this out of? He said, I don't know where you came up with that. But that number, 1 part in 10,000, is so tiny, I just can't believe it. I said, well, the data came from a Syngenta presentation to somebody else. I didn't create it. So I suggest you look into it. He said, that's got to be one powerful enzyme. I said, I have no reason to discuss the power of anything. I'm telling you the numbers that came to me. So there are people that doubt it. There are people that don't like it. There are people that don't want to deal with it. There are people that think, and Syngenta tells me this, they think that 12 rows of segregation, 12 corn rows of segregation, 12 times 30 inches, is sufficient to not be a problem. And they're going to say that, you know, the secret to pollution is dilution, or the secret to advantageous presence is pollution, is dilution. I would say, obviously, you're going to do this. You're going to dilute stuff that you can't even measure on a quick basis. And you can't see it. There's no visual. What's wrong here? So, my suggestions. What I think we need to do is set some standards, first thing. What does it mean when we say non-GMO for a particular purpose? There may be various purposes and various standards, but what do we mean? And if you don't like my numbers, what's a process that we as a community can deal with on who sets up standards? But we need a standard. In the current and the seed, we don't really have a standard. Somebody selling you non-GMO seed, you don't know. If you really want to know, you probably have to run your own tests. That's not a good way of running the economy. Potentially, I'm telling you, I think seed needs to be around 0.4, 0.5 max. There are a number of small seed companies that say they can do that. They can hit 0.1. But when I'm talking to larger seed companies with volume, they're saying that those are nearly impossible standards to meet. For traits, 0.01 is what the standard ought to be for adventitious presence coming out of amylase corn. That is a really tiny number. Now, how do you set up these standards? I don't think you do it just out of religion, out of belief. I think you have to do it with some practicality. But I'm telling you that we have been satisfying clients in a number of countries and a number of markets for years, even with 90% of the corn in the United States being GMO, 90% of the soybeans being, we've been able to meet that 0.9 standard. We reject very little. 3% of the corn, 0.5% on soybeans for these issues. On seed, I think we need to protect the commercial gene pool. We can't just say, okay, this is safe. And when we mean safe, according to the U.S. government, does it kill animals quickly? Does it kill people quickly? Does it ruin the environment quickly? Because I'm not sure anybody's doing long-term studies. It took us a long time to figure out what was killing off the eagles. Okay, it took us a long time to figure out why most of us can't drink from wells in the state of Illinois anymore. So we need to protect the commercial gene pool. We have to be able to regulate based on market impact, economic impact, I believe, as well as what's going on in the safety of the issue. Because we're not raising corn and soybeans to win a science argument. This is part of our economy. This is serious supply business that we're engaged in. So I want market impact analysis. If Syngenta were coming to me and wanted this approved, I'd say, what's your market impact analysis? What are you doing? I would want to see a dispersion study. Your corn planted in Illinois, how far does it go? How far away do I have to get under 0.01? I would like to see a containment plan. What are you going to do to keep your DNA at home and not use it on my farm? I want traceability. I want transparency. Now, traceability, I just told you we're using sophisticated scanners. Put a marker in it. Probably the most economical marker is to change its color. Make it red. Make it easy to do. Those would be reasonable considerations for us as a community to ask before we allow somebody to put something into our commercial gene pool. So you could build containment into the biotech contract you have with the folks planting it and require them to have a significant set aside. And we, as the grantors of approval to seeds, I think should have the right to condition approval on what we see. It's not once we give you the key to the market, you're there forever. If we find out this isn't working, this is causing trouble, let's be able to take it off and restrain it. The regulatory standard, I believe, should be that your crop should not unreasonably damage your neighbor's crop. Unreasonably is one of those lovely words that can mean anything and everything, but it fits here. There are some techniques that we can use in technology to modify this or minimize the damage, and one is the Puramaze gene, which keeps corn from creates a corn that rejects DNA from other hybrids. And it may be pretty close to 100%. Markers, I'd love to have visual markers in some of these things. Segregation distances, I told you, they don't have to be huge to get under the cultural standards. But if you're going to hit 0.01, you may need half a mile to a mile. And since the average size of a Midwestern farm is probably a half mile by half mile for 160 acres, a neighbor could just wipe out my entire marketing plan. Fines and damage. There's a major group on this committee that wants everything to be voluntary. Okay. But if a new seed like this came before a regulatory agency that I thought was appropriate, if it didn't meet these standards in a reasonable way, I would exclude it from the gene pool. I would say go someplace else to raise this. I don't regard it as a benefit for this community. On a farm, farmer can't escape responsibility here. So develop and incentivize best management practices at the farm. First of all, if you're either raising a crop that will damage somebody, the male end of this, I think you should notify your neighbors that you are. If you're raising a sensitive crop, organic, non-GMO, different kind of corn, waxy or something like that, I believe you should notify your neighbors. We need to establish reasonable segregation distances. I told you what I think they are, but I'm sure they vary with locality and region, prevailing winds, terrain, features. I would turn this over to the county farm service agencies. I would put somebody in official position in charge of setting up what are reasonable segregation barriers. I would consider rewarding people who engage in best management practices with maybe more favorable conservation reserve program or conservation incentives. I regard saving markets as critical, as is saving soil. And if you're saving soil around the edges of a field, that might be good for a number of reasons. For those engaged in best management practices, following these guidelines, I would limit their liability. Meaning, if you planted a crop that was damaging your neighbor, but you engaged in best management practices, we'd let you off the tort hook. If you were the recipient of, and you'd followed best management, then there would be a compensation fund to reimburse you for innocent, relatively innocent, adventitious presence. So I would check compliance too with the seed technology companies and see that they were monitoring farmers to see if they complied with the set-aside. During this very few experiments we've had with farmers being told to set aside refuges, I wouldn't say the compliance on the part of the farm community has been anything laudatory. Again, I've got the same goals here as I had on the other page. Compensate, direct losses, payment by patent holder or the source farmer. I think that makes reasonable sense, but there are probably more people that think that that doesn't. Payment by insurance funded by patent holders. And there will be major objections to that. I think that would be a reasonable place to put it. Payment by insurance arrangement. Well, is an insurance arrangement where everybody pays, predators and non-predators alike? Or is it only the prey that have to pay for the insurance? I don't know. Now, you've got other losses here that I don't have no idea how to compensate for. You've got avoidance losses. So you're planting this stuff, this amylase corn in Iowa. So you have my company, you have other companies saying, it's too dangerous to deal with that part of Iowa. We're just going to leave it. That reduces market demand. It reduces price pressure. How do I compensate for anybody for that? I have no idea how to do that. Or we can leave this all to the joy of class action lawsuits and individual tort actions and increasing loss of reputation around the world as a provider of pure product. Points in one story. Generally, when I talk about people with coexistence, they say, you know, coexist is really fine. I support it as long as I don't have to change any of my behaviors. Not one. Okay, really good. In discussions at a table like this, there are no bad players. You can't kill anybody. Everybody's got a reasonable position at the table, and opinions differ dramatically. Trait value is rarely universal. I can imagine nitrogen-fixing corn might be a universally favored trait value. But these like the amylase corn, it works for some, but it's a disaster for others. Now, blue corn story. Some of you may know Mary Howell Martin. Mary Howell runs an organic farm, an organic feed mill in upstate New York. She's on this committee. And she spoke one afternoon and said, you know, some of you people keep saying, I feel your pain. Well, I've decided that I should encourage all organic farmers to plant blue corn around the edges of their field so you can feel our pain. Now, her point is blue corn is a dominant color. And if we planted the blue corn around the edges of organic field, the neighbor would see what the pollen drift consequences are. Now, I immediately was concerned because I was the only supplier of blue corn at the table, and somebody was sure to think that I had been putting her up to it, and I didn't. Immediately, another gentleman started to express outrage. That's absolutely ridiculous. It's mean. It's ill-spirited. It is outrageous that you would suggest such a thing. This looked pretty ironical to me because he's been planting non-GMO or wants to plant GMO right next to her farm and cause same problems, actually worse problems. But he doesn't see anything wrong with that. There we have a committee. There we have a difference of opinion. Now, you should also know we do raise blue corn. And so I get complaints because we see our pollen traveling up to several miles. So over 15 years of producing blue corn contract with farmers, we fielded a number of complaints. And they typically come in and saying, I've got blue corn in my field and it's your fault. You owe me. Now, my first reaction is off the cuff, not really defensible as a good response, but as, let me see, you were raising GMO corn, but did you ask me about the impact on me? Did you consider my feelings, my market, before you planted that? And if you didn't, why should I consider your market? And it goes on from there. And then I end up saying, tell you what, I don't want you to have my blue corn any more than you've got it. So you bring it to me, we'll buy it from you at no discount. The lady next to me at the table, who is a honcho with one of the biotech companies, leans over and says, under that policy, Syngenta will be buying a lot of corn. So these things evolve. There's a list of the organizations that I think are important enough to share time and energy with. So I think you've got a list of what my biases might be. And I now invite you to express pleasure, hostility, come up with ways to answer these questions, because we as a community still need to have answers. And you got a number of players, but I don't know that any of the players has the right answer. So input would be welcome. Thanks for your time and attention.